Chapter 1: A Heart Full of Home. In the heart of a little town, hidden among towering trees and embraced by the crisp scent of pine, lived Tomas, a carpenter known to everyone. Though he spent his days shaping wood, it wasn't his skill with the hammer and chisel that made him so beloved in the town. It was his heart, wide and generous, that made him stand out. Tomas lived with his wife, Maria, and their two children, Emma and Lucas, in a large, warm house that sat at the edge of the forest. But to call it just their home wouldn't quite be true, for Tomas's house was more than just a place for his family. It was a refuge for anyone in need, a beacon of safety and kindness. Over the years, Tomas and Maria had opened their doors to many who had nowhere else to go. Orphans who had lost their parents to sickness or accident, elderly villagers who no longer had family to care for them, and travelers who had wandered too far and lost their way. Some stayed for days, some for years, but all were welcomed with the same warmth. In Tomas's house, no one was turned away, and everyone found a place at the table. Tomas had always believed in the power of a shared meal, a simple gesture that had the power to heal wounds of the heart. And so, every evening, Maria would prepare large, steaming pots of stew, fresh bread, and hearty food, made from whatever they could gather from the forest or their modest garden. The smell of Maria's cooking would fill the air, and soon everyone, Tomas, Maria, Emma, Lucas, and the many others who lived under their roof, would gather around the long wooden table Tomas had crafted with his own hands. The table seemed to grow longer every year, with more chairs added to accommodate the growing number of souls who found shelter within their walls. Though their life was simple, and often hard, there was never a shortage of joy in their home. Every evening was filled with the sound of laughter, with stories being shared, and with the kind of contentment that comes from being surrounded by love. Tomas was a quiet man, but his presence filled the room. He had a way of listening, truly listening, to each person who spoke, making them feel seen and heard. Maria, with her gentle smile and calm nature, kept everything running smoothly, even on the busiest of days. Their children, Emma and Lucas, had grown up in this house full of love and generosity, and it had shaped them into caring, thoughtful young souls. Emma, the elder of the two, had a gift for bringing joy to others. She loved to make small, thoughtful gifts for the children who came to stay with them, little dolls made from scraps of fabric or small carvings of animals she would ask her father to help her create. Lucas, still young but eager to help, followed his father around the carpentry shop, watching closely as Tomas shaped wood into tables, chairs, and toys. Lucas's favorite task was gathering wildflowers from the fields to brighten the house. He'd place small vases on window sills, filling the home with color even in the grayest of winters. For all who lived there, Tomas's house was more than just a shelter. It was a place where they could feel like they were part of a family, no matter their past or where they had come from. And Tomas, despite the heavy responsibility that came with caring for so many, always carried a sense of peace. He believed deeply that no matter how little one had, there was always enough to share. He often told Maria that the more they gave, the more they seemed to have, though neither could explain how it was possible. One particularly cold evening, as snow began to fall softly outside, the house was unusually quiet. The children had long since been tucked into bed, their rosy cheeks warm from the fire. The many others who lived with Tomas and Maria were asleep as well, their soft breaths filling the house with the rhythm of peaceful rest. Tomas and Maria sat by the fire, sipping warm tea and listening to the gentle crackle of the flames. It was in this quiet moment that Maria spoke, her voice soft and thoughtful. "Do you ever wonder if we can keep doing this?" she asked, her brow slightly furrowed with worry. "Every year, there are more people in need, and our resources are not endless. The winter is long, and sometimes I fear we will run out of food, or space, or strength." Tomas looked at his wife, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the fire. He reached out and took her hand in his. "Maria," he said, his voice steady and calm, "love is endless. And so long as we have love, we will find a way. Our resources may seem small, but somehow, there is always enough. As long as this house stands, there will be room for those in need." Maria sighed, her heart reassured by Tomas's words. She had always admired her husband's faith, his unshakable belief that the world would provide, even when things seemed impossible. And time and again, Tomas had been right. No matter how many people they had taken in, there had always been enough food, enough space, and enough love to go around. That night, Maria lay awake for a while, listening to the wind outside and thinking about the many lives that had passed through their home. Some had come and gone quickly, their needs met with a warm bed and a few meals. Others had stayed longer, healing from the wounds life had dealt them. Each person had left a mark on their home and on their hearts. Tomas, she knew, felt the weight of every soul they cared for, but he never showed it. He carried their burdens as if they were his own, yet somehow, he remained light of spirit. The next morning, the house was once again alive with activity. The smell of fresh bread baking in the oven wafted through the halls as Maria worked in the kitchen. Emma and Lucas were already up, their laughter echoing as they played a game by the window, watching the snowflakes dance outside. Tomas was in his workshop, carefully sanding a new chair he had built for one of the elderly women who had come to stay with them. As the day wore on, more people arrived at the door, seeking shelter from the cold. Some were familiar faces, people who had stayed with Tomas's family before. Others were new, travelers who had lost their way in the storm, or villagers whose homes had become too cold to bear. Tomas greeted each one with the same gentle smile, offering them a place by the fire, a warm drink, and a promise that they were welcome for as long as they needed. By the time dinner rolled around, the house was fuller than it had been in weeks. Maria's stew bubbled on the stove, filling the room with a comforting smell of vegetables and herbs. Tomas had added another bench to the dining table, and Lucas proudly announced that he had found just enough chairs for everyone. As they all sat down to eat, Tomas looked around the table, his heart swelling with gratitude. Here, in this house, there was no such thing as too many. Every person who walked through their door became part of something larger than themselves, a family, built not by blood, but by kindness, by shared meals, by the simple act of opening one's heart. And as the snow continued to fall outside, blanketing the town in white, Tomas knew that no matter what the future held, they would always have enough. For in his home, love was abundant, and in love, there was always room for one more. Chapter 2: The Storm and the Strain. That winter was unlike any other the town had ever known. The first snowfall arrived early and carried with it an ominous weight. Thick flakes descended from the sky in heavy waves, and within hours, the familiar roads and parts of the town were buried beneath a white blanket that seemed to have no end. What began as a soft, serene scene quickly turned into something far more foreboding. The snow didn't stop. Day after day, the blizzards raged, howling winds lashing against windows and piling drifts higher than anyone could remember. The town was completely isolated, cut off from the outside world, its supply routes rendered useless under towering snowbanks. In Tomas's home, the strain of the storm was felt almost immediately. His house, which had always been a refuge for those in need, soon found itself filled to the brim with people seeking shelter. One by one, neighbors, wanderers, and families with nowhere else to go appeared at Tomas's door, their faces pale with cold, their clothes soaked from trudging through the snow. And one by one, Tomas let them in, offering each a place by the fire, a warm blanket, and a promise of safety. But with each new guest, the pressure on the household grew. The pantry, once stocked with grains, vegetables, and preserves, began to look alarmingly bare. Maria, who had always managed to stretch their supplies, started to ration the food carefully, serving smaller portions to make it last. The firewood pile, which Tomas and Lucas had spent the summer chopping, dwindled with each passing day. Despite their best efforts to keep the house warm, some rooms were left cold, with only the main hall and kitchen kept aglow by the crackling fire. Each day brought new challenges. The children, who were usually free to roam and play in the fields, now stayed indoors, their laughter subdued by the howling wind outside. The elderly, who had come to rely on Tomas and Maria, needed more care, their frail bodies trembling from the cold that seeped through the walls despite their best efforts to keep it out. And as the days stretched into weeks, the faces of those who had sought refuge began to show the strain of fear that the storm would never end, that the supplies would run out, that the warmth and shelter Tomas's home provided might not be enough. One particularly harsh night, as the wind screeched outside and the snow piled higher against the doors, Tomas sat quietly by the fire, staring into the flames. His mind, usually so focused on solutions, was weighed down by the enormity of their situation. Maria, sensing his worry, sat beside him, her hand resting gently on his knee. "We've been through hard times before," she said softly, her voice steady despite the storm rattling the windows. Tomas nodded, but the weight of responsibility pressed on him more than ever. "This feels different," he said, his brow furrowed. "We've never had so many people depending on us, and the storm, it doesn't seem to be letting up. Our food is running out, the firewood is low, and we can't get more with the roads like this." Maria looked at him with her usual calm. "We've always made it work, Tomas. Somehow, we always find a way. And we're not alone. The people here, they're part of this too. We've given them a home, yes, but they can help us keep it going. We don't have to carry this all on our own." That night, as the wind screamed through the cracks in the doors, Tomas made a decision. He gathered everyone in the main hall, where the fire burned low but steady. The room was packed with people, their faces lit by the flickering flames. Children huddled together on blankets, the elderly sat with warm cups of tea, and others stood, watching Tomas expectantly. The atmosphere was heavy with unspoken fears, but Tomas's presence had always brought comfort, and they waited for his words. Tomas stood before them, his face weary from the long days of worry but still filled with the quiet strength they all knew him for. His voice, when he spoke, was calm but firm, carrying through the room like a steady heartbeat. "We're in the middle of a storm," he began. "One unlike anything we've seen before. The snow has cut us off from the rest of the world, and the supplies we have here, they're running low. We all feel it. The food is less, the firewood is less, and it's hard not to let fear take over. The room was silent. The weight of Thomas's words hung in the air, heavy as the snow outside. But then, he continued, his voice softening with hope. "But I want to remind you of something. This house, this place, it was built not just of wood and nails. It was built on the belief that no matter how hard things get, there is always enough when we come together. I know it feels like we're running out of everything, but the truth is, we have what we need right here, in each other. Love, kindness, and sharing, these are the things that make a home. And as long as we have those, we can get through anything." Tomas turned to his children, Emma and Lucas, who were sitting quietly with wide eyes, and smiled. In times like these, when the world seems cold and unforgiving, we must hold on to the warmth we create together. It may feel like we don't have enough, but I believe that kindness and love are the most powerful tools we have. As long as we share, there will always be enough. The room remained quiet for a moment, as everyone let Thomas's words sink in. Slowly, faces began to relax, the tension in the room easing as hope took root. Thomas's words, simple yet profound, had reminded them all of something vital, that they weren't just surviving this storm, they were facing it together. The next morning, the snow was still falling, and the wind still howled, but something had changed inside Thomas's home. The people who had once been passive recipients of Thomas's kindness now took active roles in keeping the house running. The men who were able gathered what little wood they could find, chopping it into smaller pieces to make it last longer. The women helped Maria in the kitchen, stretching the remaining food into soups and stews that could feed more mouths with less. The children, instead of moping by the windows, began to help where they could, carrying blankets, collecting snow to melt for water, and doing their best to keep the spirits high. And Tomas, seeing the way his words had sparked this new sense of unity, felt a renewed sense of purpose. He worked tirelessly alongside the others, his heart lifted by the way the house had transformed from a place of worry into a haven of shared strength. As the days wore on, the storm showed no signs of stopping, but the people inside Thomas's house continued to weather it with courage and resilience. They sang songs around the fire, told stories to pass the time, and found small ways to keep hope alive. And each night, as the blizzard howled outside, they gathered once again in the main hall, their spirits lifted by the warmth of the fire and the knowledge that, as long as they had each other, they would endure. Thomas's house, once a refuge for those in need, had become something more. It had become a symbol of the strength that comes from unity, from kindness, and from love. And though the storm raged on, inside that house, there was a warmth that no cold could touch. Chapter 3: The Gift of Giving. The storm that had once seemed endless finally began to loosen its grip on the town. After weeks of unrelenting snow, the first rays of sunlight pierced the grey sky, casting a warm, golden light over the blanket of snow. Gradually, the snow began to melt, trickling down from the rooftops and pooling in the streets. The sound of the dripping water was the sweetest music anyone had heard in weeks. The townspeople, huddled in their homes, emerged cautiously into the thawing world, their eyes squinting in the unfamiliar brightness. For Tomas and his family, the end of the storm brought a mixture of relief and reflection. The road to town, once buried beneath feet of snow, was now visible again, and soon, supply carts from the city began making their way into town. Fresh food, firewood, and essential goods arrived, and the town slowly began to regain its rhythm. But in Thomas's home, something far more profound had taken root. Inside the large house that had sheltered so many during the storm, a sense of unity and purpose now permeated every corner. The people who had sought refuge there had formed bonds that went beyond simple survival. They had become a family of sorts, bound together not by blood, but by the shared experience of weathering the storm. And with the thawing of the snow came the blossoming of new opportunities. For many of the townspeople who had lived in Tomas's home during the storm, returning to their previous lives seemed unthinkable. Their time under Tomas's roof had changed them. The kindness they had received, the warmth of a shared meal, and the sense of belonging had given them more than just shelter from the cold, it had given them a renewed sense of purpose. And so, many chose to stay. Those who stayed in Tomas's home didn't just stay as guests. They became active participants in the life of the house. Some of the men, inspired by Tomas's skill and generosity, began to help him in the carpentry shop. They learned to sand and shape the wood, crafting chairs, tables, and shelves that they would sell to support the household. Others, particularly the women, began to take over the teaching of the children, turning what had been a temporary shelter into a place of learning and laughter. One afternoon, Tomas found himself in the garden that had once been buried beneath snow. The earth was still cold, but patches of green were beginning to emerge. Maria stood beside him, her hands dirt-stained as she tended to the soil, preparing it for the spring planting. "We'll have a good harvest this year," Maria said, her eyes shining with optimism. "The garden will bloom again." Tomas smiled at his wife. "Just like our home," he said. "It's not just a house anymore, is it?" Maria shook her head. "No, it's more than that now. It's a community." And it was true. The house that had once sheltered a family of four had become a place of refuge, not just from the cold, but from life's hardships. It had become a home for the lost, the wandering, and the weary. Tomas's vision of a home filled with love and giving had grown into something greater than he could have ever imagined. That evening, the fire in the hearth crackled warmly as the household gathered in the main hall for dinner. The long wooden table, the one Tomas had crafted with his own hands, stretched even further now, with new benches added to accommodate the growing number of residents. The room was filled with the sound of conversation, laughter, and clinking dishes. The air was thick with the smell of stew and freshly baked bread. And at the head of the table, Tomas sat with his family, Maria, Emma, and Lucas. Emma, now growing into a bright and curious young girl, sat beside her father, her eyes wide as she listened to the stories being shared around the table. Lucas, her younger brother, played with a wooden toy horse that Tomas had carved for him, his face lit with joy. Tomas looked around the room, his heart swelling with pride and contentment. After the meal, as the fire began to die down and the children prepared for bed, Tomas sat quietly by the hearth. His hands, rough and calloused from years of carpentry, rested on his lap as he gazed into the glowing embers. The room, now quiet, was filled with a deep sense of peace. Maria came to sit beside him, her head resting on his shoulder. "Look at what we've built," she whispered. Tomas nodded. "It's more than I ever dreamed," he said softly. "You were right," Maria continued, her voice filled with warmth. "Love truly is endless." Tomas smiled. "It always has been. And the more we give, the more we seem to have. I used to worry that we wouldn't have enough, but now, it's as if we've been blessed tenfold." The people who had come to depend on Tomas and Maria's kindness didn't leave after the storm. Instead, they became part of a new way of life, one built on mutual support, kindness, and generosity. The garden bloomed again in the spring, and with it, new possibilities. Those who had been strangers only months before now worked together to grow vegetables, tend to animals, and make the house a true home. Emma and Lucas grew up in a household where giving was not just a lesson, but a way of life. They learned from their parents that true wealth wasn't measured by the possessions you had, but by the love and kindness you shared. Emma, inspired by the many people who had come through their doors, began to dream of becoming a teacher, while Lucas followed in his father's footsteps, showing a talent for carpentry that made Thomas proud. As the years passed, word of Thomas's house spread far and wide. Travelers from distant villages came to the little town, not just to seek shelter, but to be part of the life Thomas had created. His home had become a beacon of hope, a place where people knew they could find warmth, kindness, and community, no matter who they were or where they came from. Thomas's legacy grew, not just in the town, but beyond. His story became a symbol of the power of giving, and how one man's kindness could change the lives of so many. People came from miles around, eager to learn from Thomas, to share in the work, and to be part of something greater than themselves. And so, Thomas's home continued to thrive, not because of its walls or roof, but because of the hearts that filled it. It was a place where love was endless, and where the gift of giving was the greatest treasure of all. And as long as that spirit of kindness endured, Thomas's home would remain a beacon of hope, lighting the way for all who sought its warmth.